G'day everyone, I'm really excited to present to you the second and final part of the video series explaining how to make your very own carnivorous plants rock garden. In my last video I demonstrated how to make planters out of pumice stone and how you can create these beautiful wild looking planters featuring your favourite carnivorous plant. In this video I'm going to be demonstrating how you can arrange these pumice stone planters within these plastic trays to create your very own wild looking carnivorous plants rock garden. And I'm also going to be giving you a few hints and tips on how to create some interesting effects within the pumice stone itself to create those wild natural effects. And of course I'm going to be explaining how to best water this type of garden so they're nicely watered even during those hot summer days. At the end of the day though, take this as a guide because it's all about using your creativity to create your very own wild looking garden. Okay, so these are the plants I'm going to be incorporating into my miniature garden, for now at least anyway. Here in front of me I've got a red form of Drosera capensis. That's a South African sundew. That's this sundew over here. I absolutely love those red leaves contrasting with that green leaf base down the bottom. So it's going to add a lot of colour to this miniature garden and can't wait to add it. Here at the base we've got two Drosera spatulatas. These are native Australian sundews, and as the name suggests, the leaves are shaped like spatulas, and again it's going to add even more colour with those gorgeous red leaves. Now this is a Sarracenia swaniana. Thank you to my YouTube subscriber who pointed this plant out because I wasn't quite sure what it was, and after doing a bit of research online I'm pretty sure that this plant here is a Sarracenia swaniana, and I'm going to assume that as well. Now just love those various shades of red depending on how mature those pictures are. So again it's going to add even more colour to this miniature garden. It's a great selection. Here in the background of course is my gorgeous pumice stone planter with my favourite Venus Flytrap. I featured in my last video on how to make this planter, so go and have a look at that video to get an idea. But if I just zoom in here, it's only been in here for a week, this plant, and also this sphagnum moss. And you can see how this sphagnum moss is coming up with these gorgeous light green shoots, indicating, yep, that it's happy in there and it's trying to establish itself. So yeah, very happy so far with that. And adding even more colour and texture, I'm going to be adding this lush green moss. Just love how the texture is like carpet, and I just of course love that beautiful shade of green. I'm not sure what type of moss this is because it does grow extensively with my other plants, but I'm just not sure what it is. But that's why I'm adding it, because I know it will grow well in the garden. And of course I'm also going to be adding these tropical sundews, which are these small sundews here that will get bigger. And you can see here, just to get an idea of how gorgeous they look once they get established. Now it's important when you're adding plants to any garden that they complement each other. Think about the colours of the plants that you're going to be adding. Think about any contrasting colours that you want in there. You also want plants which sort of don't overshadow the other plants too much, so you don't want plants which are too fast growing. And because I'm going to be putting plants in these planters, you don't want plants which have too an extensive root system, because it's sort of going to become root bound within those pumice stone planters. So these plants here are good selections for that miniature garden. So now that we have an idea of the plants I'm going to be incorporating into my garden, let's just focus on the plastic trays themselves. So why use these trays? Well, the beauty of them is that they're quite low, but they've got quite a wide surface area. So this one, say it's around about 40 centimetres across. That's what makes them ideal for displaying your plants within the tray. It gives you that room, and because it's quite low, it really does accentuate the plants within the actual tray. Because it's got a wide surface area, it also provides a lot of humidity that creates a nice microclimate, which the carnivorous plants absolutely love. So when the peat moss gets damp inside, it releases that water vapor, and of course that's what keeps those plants happy. Now, another thing that I love about these trays is that you can get them in various sizes. So that means that you can nestle this one into a larger tray, or you can put a smaller one in this tray, okay? And that's what makes it easy then to water this rock garden. Now, that's exactly what I've done here with this more established garden. I've placed this garden here, which is the same size as this tray here, and I've placed it into this larger tray. Whenever I water it, I just simply pour water into this larger tray, and that's what keeps that the little miniature garden there nicely hydrated, and that's what keeps the plants happy. Of course, I will be drilling holes in here to allow that water to be absorbed, but that's going to be shown later on. But if you are looking for something like this, just go to your local hardware store. Look for any trays, as I said, that come in various sizes. And as I said, the beauty of it is you can just put them within each other. They nicely sit within each other, and because they're sort of the same colour, roughly the same size, it really does a great job of accentuating the plants within that inner tray. Okay, so we've drilled the holes down the bottom of the tray. We've installed our mesh. I'm going to be talking about the pumice rocks and how I've manipulated them to fit into the tray. But before then, we have to start filling up the tray with our peat moss mixture. This is a mixture made up of 3 parts peat moss to 1 part propagating sand. And once we've filled that tray up with this peat moss, we can then start positioning the pumice rocks. Geez, I really do feel like I'm making a cake here. Okay, so I've almost filled the tray up with the peat moss mixture. I left a bit of a gap on the top because the next step I'm going to pour water onto the peat moss mixture and allow the water to go through the bottom of the tray. I'm basically going to be using this tray as a type of colander. In doing so, I'm going to help remove any contaminants that may be present in the peat moss mixture. Things like mold, spores or fungal spores, which can grow on top of the peat moss mixture. So yeah, so this step is optional, but I do recommend it just to make sure that your miniature garden is going to look its best. When pouring water from the top, apply a fine stream of water to prevent dislodging the peat moss. Here I've used an empty cardboard milk container where I've drilled holes on the top of the lid. To prevent any build-up of minerals in the peat moss, use either rainwater, distilled water, or reverse osmosis filtered water. It's been a couple of days since I last rinsed my peat moss mixture, and overnight it has rained a bit, so that's given this peat moss here a really good rinse, laying a good foundation for our miniature garden. Now, of course, is the fun bit. It's the bit where you use all your creativity to create whatever effect that you want to in your miniature garden. we're going to be adding our plants here. We're going to be arranging our pumice rocks and of course adding any mosses there to really create that nice, wild, natural look. So just to give you an idea of what I'm going to be adding to the miniature garden, I'm going to be adding this pumice rock planter featuring this beautiful Venus Flytrap. This is the one that I made in my last video. I'm going to be placing that planter into the tray until the bottom of that planter is on the bottom of the tray. So I'm going to have to take out some peat moss first for that. Just have a look over here as to how well the plants grow around the planter itself. This started off as a pumice rock planter and all it had was a couple of these tropical sundews in there and some moss growing there, and you can see over time just how the plants have grown nicely around and on the rock itself. I'm going to be adding these two pieces of pumice rock. It did start off as one, but the rock itself was a bit large, so all I did was just used a metal chisel and a hammer to break this pumice rock into two. What I want to do later on is drill some holes on either side of this pumice rock pieces and add this moss in there to create a nice interesting effect. This is the moss that I'm going to be adding. I've just taken the top part of the peat moss where the moss was growing using a pair of scissors, just used the blades to remove that top section of moss. There's a link in the comments box to the video explaining how best to do that. Over here I've got some live sphagnum moss. Doesn't look like much now, but if I just show you here just how nice it looks when it gets more established. You can see down here growing amongst the Venus Flytraps just how lush it looks. And I'll come over here on this side. You can see it really stands out with that filtering sunlight. And of course I'm going to be adding my carnivorous plants. I have decided to also add this Drosera banata tea-form sundew. It's a native Australian sundew. It's quite a tall sundew. That's the same one that's growing in this more established one right here. That's the leaves right there, the tea form. And it started off as one plant, and over time it has produced 3 shoots which have gone across the tray. So it just goes to show that even though these trays are quite shallow, the plants do a beautiful job of adapting to that by growing with their roots across the tray. And as you can see, the plants are quite happy. Just to allow for that pumice rock planter there on the right. So just remove that until it gets down to the mesh or fly screen that you've placed in there. Okay, of course we're going to get that planter now. And just going to arrange that into the tray. So I'm going to have this right up against the tray itself, so it's important that it's quite balanced. It's nice and flat. And then once you've done that, just simply place the pumice on the peat moss around the planter. Just lay that nicely, tuck it in under the bottom of it. Do the same here as well on the other side. Just place that like that. Now this side looks like it's a little bit up, so if you want to, you can always place peat moss underneath it just to sort of balance it out so it's a bit more flatter, that planter. Let's do that. That looks a bit flatter now. So this is our firmly placed pumice rock planter. I've packed in nicely the peat moss around the base and around the edge of the planter just to firmly secure it. And also what I've done is, any of these natural crevices in the rock, I've just placed a little bit of that peat moss in there. The reason why I've done that is because when the plants become more established, when the seeds start to get produced, wherever those seeds land, they will start to grow amongst the pumice rock where the peat moss is, and that's going to create that very nice wild natural look. As I said earlier, I was going to drill holes into each inner face of these pieces of pumice rock. As it's turned out, as I was drilling into this rock over here, it's fallen apart. So instead, I'm just going to use these two pieces over here and incorporate them into my miniature garden. Just goes to show it's all about using imagination and try to make do with what you have to create that effect that you're looking to achieve. Okay, so these are the two rocks that fell apart whilst I was drilling into the rock. You can see how unnatural this part looks here with that rounded edge. So instead of exposing that unnatural look, I've decided to arrange these two pieces in this way, like this. Now you can only see the natural angles and natural look of that rock, which is what I want to achieve. And I've decided to sort of lean those rocks up against like this. Now, as more soil is packed around it, there's going to be less of those rocks exposed, but I'm just going to have that cavity down there open to allow for this sphagnum moss to grow into. Now, sphagnum moss, it's a beautiful moss which doesn't like direct sunlight, and it likes a nice damp environment. So I thought by angling the rocks like this and having the sphagnum moss growing in there should provide a nice growing environment. And that's what is the beauty of creating these miniature gardens with pumice rocks, because you can create a three-dimensional growing platform for the plants in your garden. Okay, so I've got the angle that I want, and I'm going to start now to pack around the base of these pieces of pumice rock with peat moss. Now, the beauty of this tray arrangement is that you can vary the depth of the peat moss within the tray. So of course you can see up here how it's higher, and then down here it becomes quite low. And by having different depths of peat moss within the tray, you can create more damper conditions. So as a general rule, the lower the peat moss in the tray, the wetter the growing conditions, and then once you know that, you can then start to put the appropriate plants in there. And that's why I've decided to put that sphagnum moss in there. So I'm just going to now continue packing this in. Okay, so I've sort of packed in that peat moss around the base quite snugly, and as always, what I do with these peat moss, any sort of crevices in the rock, I just place the peat moss into, because what will happen is the peat moss soaks up water, and that, because it's porous, will keep that peat moss nice and damp, which is going to be a good growing platform for any moss spores or any seeds that may land there. Okay, as well as placing peat moss into the crevices of the rock, what you can also do is start building up the peat moss along the sides of the pumice rock. Of course, the higher up the peat moss is, the more chance that there's going to be things like moss and seedlings growing there, and it's going to again provide a different effect. It's going to look more natural, and it's going to provide a more seamless look between the peat moss and the actual rock itself. So I'm just doing the finishing touches here to this peat moss, packing it down nice and tight, especially around the base of those pumice rocks, just to help secure them. You'll notice here that I've also placed this tray into another tray full of water. That just ensures that that peat moss remains damp, and it just makes it easier to work with. So as I've been doing this, I've thought about trying to add a more natural effect to this pumice stone planter featuring this Venus Flytrap. And I thought I want to add probably some pieces of moss to it. So I'm just going to show you now how I'm going to achieve that. To make it easier to drill into the rock, I've had the planter sitting in a tray of water. Notice how I'm not drilling all the way through the rock. Okay, so this is the piece of moss that I'm going to be putting in there. So now I'm going to be just plugging it into the hole. Just make sure it's a nice snug fit. Try to press on the sides rather than pressing on top of the actual moss itself to try and secure it into those holes. Okay, now it doesn't matter that it hasn't those holes haven't been drilled all the way through, because that pumice rock is porous. It will absorb water, and because there's already peat moss in there, that will keep that moss alive and growing well. So here's another piece of peat moss with the moss, and of course also some tropical sundews in there, so I thought that would be a great addition as well. So now I'm just going to put that into the holes. Now I've got a bamboo skewer here just to help you to put it snugly into the hole without actually pressing onto the plants themselves. Okay, just keep doing that. Again, you want a nice snug fit. There we go. Now if there's a little bit of cavity there, you can always plug in some peat moss in there just to fill those holes up. Again, just use your bamboo skewer to help put that peat moss into the cavity, and that will just help to sustain that moss growing on top. Okay, so this is how the moss looks like. You can see how it's really added a nice dash of colour to that rock, and of course it looks a lot more natural now with that moss growing around the edges there. To avoid damaging the plant, push the peat moss up to the stem rather than pressing down on the leaves with your fingers. This is the Drosera capensis. Because of its longer roots, I've had to excavate across the tray to allow for the plant. Here I'm simply placing live sphagnum moss on top of the peat moss. Carefully placing live sphagnum moss around the base of the plants. It doesn't hurt to place sphagnum moss around the edges of the pumice rock. Watering the sphagnum moss helps to hydrate it and helps to settle it into the peat moss. Okay, so here's my finished Carnivorous plants rock garden. Just a few tips. Don't overcrowd your garden. I know there's a lot of spaces in between these plants, but there's a good reason for that. That's because these plants will start to fill out as they produce more leaves. So those spaces around them will start to get filled up. You want to sort of complement each of the plants. You don't want one plant overcrowding the other, okay? You'll notice here how I've left a lot of room around this Venus Flytrap. The reason is simple. I learnt from my first garden here just how well these flytraps grow in these pumice stone planters. These started off as two planters right here, and as you can see, you can't even see the rock unless you really look carefully in there amongst those leaves. But you can still see here mosses growing in there. You can still see sundews growing amongst there, so it still maintains that wild, natural look. But yeah, just try not to overcrowd them. Allow some space from the start, and as they grow and develop, they really will start to complement each other, and you will have a beautiful garden to be proud of.